The armory at FOB Viper smelled of solvent and gun oil, a scent Staff Sergeant Elena Vance had long ago stopped noticing. She worked the cleaning rod through her M40A6 with practiced movements, the pre-dawn quiet broken only by the soft clink of metal and Corporal Webb checking their gear bags across the table. 6 months in Kunar Province had taught her that mornings belonged to preparation. The afternoons belonged to the valley, to the sun that turned every rock face into a mirror and every scope into a liability. She finished with the barrel and set the rifle aside, then reached into her breast pocket. The mirror was smaller than a playing card. Its edges had been filed down with a precision that would have impressed a jeweler, the backing painted matte black to eliminate any secondary reflection. Scratched into its surface was a grid of fine lines, each one measured and etched by her own hand over 3 patient evenings in a machine shop at Camp Leatherneck. Elena angled it toward the window where the first gray light was seeping through. The reflection caught the ceiling, then the far wall, then settled on a point just above Webb's head. Good. The coating hadn't degraded overnight. Webb glanced up, checking the light again. Staff Sergeant? Every morning, she said. The sun doesn't care about her schedule. She thought about the sniper instructors who had trained her, the ones who relied on $1,000 optics and thermal imaging systems that could see through walls. They were good tools for certain environments. But Kunar wasn't certain environments. Kunar was harsh angles and blazing afternoons and enemy fighters who had learned exactly what American equipment could and couldn't do. Wherever you are right now, she thought, whatever conditions you work in, there's always something the standard kit doesn't account for. A tool everyone dismisses until the day it's the only thing that works. She wondered how many people watching understood that feeling, the certainty that your environment demanded something different than what you'd been given. The compound gate rumbled open outside, and Elena tucked the mirror away as Webb moved to the window. Rangers, he said. Looks like 8 of them. The joint operation briefing wasn't until 07:30, which meant this unit had arrived early to establish themselves. Elena recognized the pattern. Every elite unit had its own way of marking territory, and Rangers preferred the direct approach. Arrive first, spread out, make everyone else feel like guests. She resumed, cleaning her rifle as boots thudded down the corridor and the armory door swung open. The man who entered wore Master Sergeant stripes and the distinctive tan beret, pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he knew exactly how it looked. His name tape read Decker, and his eyes swept the room with a quick assessment of someone cataloging threats and dismissing them in the same motion. 3 Rangers filed in behind him, immediately claiming the far workbench and beginning to unpack equipment that gleamed with the factory-fresh sheen of gear that had never seen extended field use. Decker's gaze landed on Elena, moved to her rifle, then to the small object she'd set on the table beside her cleaning kit. He crossed the room in 4 strides and picked up the mirror without asking. "What's this?" he said, turning it over in his fingers. "Checking your makeup before mission?" One of the Rangers laughed. Another made a comment about field cosmetics that Elena didn't bother to register. She kept her voice level. "It's a spotting tool. Works in high-angle sun conditions when standard optics create glare signatures." Decker held the mirror up to the light, squinting at the etched grid lines. "A spotting tool," he repeated. He said the words slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "You're telling me you use this little thing to find targets?" "In specific conditions, yes." He tossed it back on a table with a clatter that made Webb tense. "Girl Scout nonsense," Decker said. He turned to his Rangers with a grin. "You hear that? While we're running thermal imaging that costs more than her entire kit, she's out here playing with mirrors." The Rangers' laughter came easier now, the kind of laughter that invited participation and punished silence. Elena picked up the mirror and slipped it back in her pocket. "Sergeant Vance has 17 confirmed kills this deployment," Webb said quietly. Decker's smile didn't waver. "Good for her. Let's see how many she gets when we're running real operations instead of babysitting convoys." He led his team toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back. "The briefing's at 0730, right? Try not to be late." The door swung shut behind them, leaving the armory in silence. Webb exhaled slowly. You want me to say something to the lieutenant? Elena shook her head. She slid a fresh round into the chamber of her rifle and began the function check. The mirror pressed against her chest, warm from her body heat, its filed edges smooth against the fabric of her pocket. Saying something wouldn't change anything. Men like Decker only learned one way, and that lesson was never delivered in words. Outside, the sun crept higher over the eastern ridge, beginning its long arc toward the position it would hold at noon. Directly overhead, blazing down into the valley where the enemy waited in positions they'd chosen specifically because American technology couldn't see them there. Elena finished her function check and began packing her gear. 12 hours from now, the conditions would be perfect. The briefing room at FOB Viper had been a storage warehouse before someone bolted folding chairs to the concrete floor and hung a projection screen from the ceiling. Captain Reyes stood at the front with a laptop connected to the screen, his intelligence officer insignia catching the blue glow of the satellite imagery behind him. Elena took a seat in the second row with Webb beside her. The Rangers spread across the back, Decker positioned at the center of their formation like a general surveying his troops before battle. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw entered last, nodding to Reyes as he took a position against the sidewall where he could observe the entire room. Reyes clicked to the first slide. Gentlemen, Staff Sergeant, welcome to Operation Ridgeline. He let the satellite image settle on the screen. A narrow valley cutting between two mountain ridges, the terrain rendered in false color that highlighted elevation changes. This is Shadal Valley, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of our position. For the past 6 weeks, enemy sniper teams have been operating from elevated positions along both ridges. He clicked again. 3 red markers appeared on the map. 3 Marine units have taken casualties attempting to move supplies through this corridor. 7 wounded, 2 killed. The enemy has demonstrated sophisticated counter-detection capabilities. They're choosing positions specifically designed to defeat our standard reconnaissance methods. Elena studied the markers. The positions formed a pattern she recognized. High ground with eastern exposure, rock formations that would absorb morning sun and radiate heat throughout the afternoon. Thermal imaging would show the entire ridgeline as a uniform hot zone, making individual fighters invisible against the background. Reyes outlined the mission parameters. Ranger Element would conduct direct assault on suspected enemy positions along the western ridge. Elena's sniper team would provide overwatch from an elevated position designated Alpha, covering the Rangers' approach and engaging targets of opportunity. A hand went up in the back row. Decker stood without waiting to be acknowledged. Captain, my team is equipped with Gen 4 thermal imaging. We can identify and engage targets through any concealment. He gestured toward Elena without looking at her. Traditional Overwatch seems redundant when we have that capability organic to our unit. Reyes glanced at Bradshaw, who remained motionless against the wall. The Overwatch element provides redundant coverage, Reyes said carefully. Belt and suspenders approach. Decker smiled. With respect, sir, suspenders don't help much when you're wearing a belt that actually works. The Rangers chuckled. Elena felt Webb tense beside her. She spoke without raising her hand. The thermal systems will show false positives throughout the afternoon. Those rock formations retain heat from morning sun exposure. By 1100, your scopes will read the entire valley floor as occupied. Decker turned to face her directly. Sounds like an excuse for why we might not need your help. It's physics, Elena said. The rocks heat to approximately the same temperature as a human body. Your thermals can't distinguish between them. My thermals cost more than your annual salary, Staff Sergeant. I think I'll trust the equipment. Bradshaw pushed off from the wall. The mission parameters are set. He looked at Decker, then at Elena. Ranger Element assaults Western Ridge. Sniper team provides overwatch. Questions about the actual operation? No one spoke. Reyes finished the briefing with timeline details. Movement to positions at 0430, assault phase beginning at 0900, expected completion by 1400. Elena noted that 1400 was precisely when the sun would be at its worst angle, turning every scope in the valley into a beacon for enemy spotters. The room emptied in clusters, Rangers filing out together while Marines gathered around Reyes with follow-up questions. Elena collected her notes and moved toward the door. Outside the briefing room, she paused near a stack of supply crates where the corridor bent toward the armory. Decker's voice carried clearly from around the corner. "You see their gear? Museum equipment. The woman's carrying a rifle my grandfather could have used." Decker's tone carried the easy confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. "We handle the real work tomorrow. The Marines can watch and learn." A younger voice responded. "What about that mirror thing she had?" Decker laughed. "What about it? She's going to reflect sunlight into her own eyes while we clear the valley. Just stay on mission and let me worry about coordinating with the locals." Elena turned away before they emerged from the corridor. Webb was waiting for her near the armory entrance, his expression asking a question he didn't voice. "Get some sleep," she told him. "We move in 8 hours." She walked to her quarters through the compound's dusty paths, past Rangers checking their gleaming equipment and Marines performing the quieter rituals of preparation that came with experience. Her hand found a mirror in her pocket, fingers tracing the filed edges. Tomorrow the sun would rise over the eastern ridge and begin its climb toward noon. By afternoon, the valley would become exactly what she had described, a heat trap that rendered thermal imaging useless, a killing ground designed by an enemy who understood American technology better than Americans wanted to admit. Decker would learn. They always did, eventually. The only question was how many people would pay for the lesson. The mountain trail was barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, a thread of packed earth winding between boulders that loomed like sleeping giants. Elena moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that silence was worth more than speed, her boots finding the solid ground by instinct while Webb followed 3 meters behind. They had left the FOB at 0400, allowing 30 minutes to reach the position designated Overwatch Alpha. The Rangers would begin their movement at 0500, taking the longer but more accessible route through the lower valley. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridge, everyone would be in position. Elena paused at a junction where the trail split around a massive outcropping. She studied the rock face, calculating angles she had memorized from satellite imagery the night before. "This way," she said softly. Webb followed without question as she took the left fork, climbing toward a recessed ledge that would be invisible from the valley floor. The position had cost her 2 hours of analysis to find, a natural hide site that would remain in shadow throughout the afternoon while the terrain below baked in direct sunlight. She settled into the depression and began arranging her equipment. 3 rifles laid out in a row, each zeroed to a different range. Ammunition sorted by type. Rangefinder, spotting scope that she would use sparingly, only when conditions allowed. And the mirror, which she placed on a flat rock at the edge of the ledge where it could catch the first light. Webb set up beside her, unfolding his own equipment with the quiet efficiency of a spotter who had learned to match his sniper's rhythm. "You picked this spot for the shadows," he said. Elena nodded. "By noon, we'll be the only thing in this valley not radiating heat. Their thermals will slide right over us. And the scopes?" She gestured toward the eastern ridge, where the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. "In 4 hours, the sun will be high enough to create lens flare on any optic pointed into the valley. Enemy spotters know exactly what to look for. One flash, and they'll have our position." Webb was quiet for a moment. "How did you figure all this out?" "The mirror thing, the angles. They didn't teach this at Scout Sniper School." Elena adjusted the mirror's position by a fraction of a degree. "There was an instructor," she said, "retired master sergeant who did 3 tours in Vietnam. He came in for a week-long seminar my second year. Everyone else was learning the new thermal systems, so his class was nearly empty. What did he teach? How to see without being seen. How to use the environment instead of fighting it." She picked up the mirror and angled it toward the lightening sky. In the jungle, he couldn't use scopes half the time. Too much moisture, too much vegetation. So he learned to read reflections. Light bouncing off leaves, off water, off anything that would give him information without giving away his position. And a mirror? His idea. I just refined it for the desert. Below them, the sound of movement drifted up from the lower trail. Elena watched through her rangefinder as the ranger element picked their way through the rocks, their silhouettes dark against the gray pre-dawn. The pointman swept his thermal scope across the terrain ahead, pausing at each cluster of boulders before waving the team forward. He's clearing cold rocks, Webb observed. Elena watched the methodical sweeps. Right now those rocks are cooler than the ambient air. His thermal reads them as empty. She shifted her attention to a formation further up the valley where the enemy had been operating. In 6 hours, those same rocks will be the same temperature as a human body. Every sweep will show contacts that aren't there, and he'll miss the ones that are. The Rangers continued their movement, confident in their equipment and their training. Decker's voice crackled over the radio net. Ranger element approaching phase line alpha. All systems green. Ready to prosecute. Elena keyed her radio. Overwatch Alpha in position. She kept her voice neutral, professional. Standing by. There was a pause before Decker responded. Copy, Overwatch. Try to keep up. She set the radio aside and picked up the mirror. The first rays of sunlight were touching the eastern ridge, and she angled the small reflective surface to catch them. Light bounced off the mirror and scattered across the valley below, illuminating details that were invisible to direct observation. The shadow of a rock formation that suggested a hollow space behind it, the glint of something metallic 300 meters up the opposite slope, the subtle color variation in the soil that indicated recent disturbance. She began mapping the terrain in her mind, marking each anomaly for later reference. The metallic glint could be equipment. The hollow space could conceal fighters. The disturbed soil could mark a position that had been used and abandoned. The enemy had chosen this valley for a reason. They knew American capabilities, knew exactly what thermal imaging could and could not see. They had built their positions to exploit those limitations. But they had never encountered someone who could see without looking directly. Someone who could find them in the light they thought made them invisible. Elena settled into her position as the sun continued its climb. For hours until the conditions would be perfect. For hours until Decker learned what his expensive equipment couldn't show him. She was patient. The desert had taught her that much. The sun climbed above the eastern ridge at 0900, flooding the valley with harsh sidelighting that turned every surface into a confusion of glare and shadow. Elena had been waiting for this moment. She angled the mirror with her left hand, catching the sunlight and directing it across the far slope in a slow sweep. The reflected beam was invisible to anyone not directly in its path, a ghost of illumination that revealed what direct observation could not see. There, a flicker of light bouncing back at her from 1,100 meters out. She adjusted the mirror by millimeters, confirming the reflection. Something glass or polished metal, positioned in a cluster of rocks that looked identical to 100 other formations on the slope. A scope, a rifle scope, aimed down into the valley where the Rangers were advancing. Contact, she said quietly. Webb was already on his spotting scope, searching the area she indicated. I don't see anything, he said. You won't. The rocks behind him are the same color as his clothing. He's in complete visual defilade. She reached for her radio. Overwatch Alpha to Ranger Element. Single shooter, grid reference force of enter, 263. 1,100 meters, western slope, rock formation with a split top. The radio crackled. Decker's voice came back flat with skepticism. Negative, Overwatch. Thermal shows nothing at that grid. You're jumping at shadows. Elena kept the mirror steady, watching the tiny reflection that marked her target. The shooter hadn't moved. He was patient, waiting for the Rangers to enter his kill zone. Recommend you hold position, she said. I have positive identification on a rifle scope. My scope says that position is empty, Decker replied. Ranger element continuing movement. Elena set down the radio and picked up her rifle. The M40A6 settled against her shoulder with familiar weight, the stock pressing into the pocket beneath her collarbone. She found the rock formation through her scope, saw nothing but stone and shadow. But she had already marked the position. She knew exactly where the reflection had originated, could calculate the angle and distance with precision that didn't require visual confirmation. She exhaled slowly, letting her heartbeat settle into the steady rhythm that preceded every shot. The trigger broke clean, and the rifle pushed back against her shoulder. 1,100 meters away, the rock formation remained motionless for a long moment. Then something shifted, a shape separating from the stones and sliding downward in the boneless collapse of a body with no life left to control it. Webb sucked in a breath. Contact confirmed. Enemy down. The radio erupted. What the hell are you shooting at, Overwatch? Decker's voice had lost its smoothness. I told you that position was clear. Target eliminated, Elena said. Recommend you verify. 500 meters below her position, Specialist Torres was moving with a Ranger forward element when the call came through. He pulled his binoculars and scanned the rock formation the sniper had identified. Nothing, just rocks and shadows and the harsh morning light that made everything look the same. Then he saw it, a dark shape wedged between two boulders, a shape that hadn't been there a moment ago. A body, sprawled in the unnatural arrangement of sudden death, a rifle still clutched in hands that would never fire it. Ranger 2 to Ranger Lead, Torres said into his radio. I have visual on the target. Confirmed enemy Kia. He paused, staring at the impossible shot. She was right, Sergeant. Decker's response was immediate. Lucky shot. Stay on mission, Ranger 2. We're not stopping for one confirmed. Torres lowered his binoculars and rejoined his team, but his eyes kept drifting up toward the ridge where the Marine sniper had her position. He couldn't see her, couldn't see any indication that anyone was up there at all, but she had seen the enemy when their own equipment showed nothing. On the ridge, Elena was already sweeping the mirror across the next sector. The sunlight caught another reflection, then another. Two more positions, both in terrain that thermal imaging would read as empty. Two more, she told Webb. Mark them. She worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and settled into her shooting position. The second target was at 1,300 meters, slightly uphill, partially concealed behind a lip of stone that would have made the shot impossible without knowing exactly where to aim. The mirror had shown her. The mirror always showed her. She fired. The target dropped. She shifted right, found a third position, calculated the wind adjustment for the changed angle. Fired again. Webb confirmed both kills in a voice that had gone slightly hoarse. 3 down. No return fire. They never saw you. Elena ejected the spent casing and reached for fresh ammunition. The Rangers were still moving through the valley below, still sweeping their useless thermal scopes across rocks that told them nothing. Decker's voice came over the radio, demanding to know what she was engaging now. She ignored him. The sun was still climbing. The day was just beginning. And somewhere on those slopes, more enemies waited in positions they thought were invisible. She angled the mirror and continued her sweep. Specialist Torres was 20 meters behind the Ranger pointman when a valley exploded. The first burst of gunfire came from the western slope, a chattering roar that sent rock chips spraying across the trail. Torres threw himself behind a boulder as rounds snapped through the air where he had been standing. Somewhere to his left, a man screamed. Contact left, someone shouted. Contact left, multiple shooters. Decker's voice cut through the chaos. Thermal sweep, give me positions. Torres watched the team's thermal operator swing his scope across the western slope. The man's face twisted in confusion. Nothing, he called back. Thermal shows nothing. Just hot rocks. Another burst of fire tore through the formation. Torres heard the wet impact of a round finding flesh, heard another Ranger cry out and drop. 2 wounded now, maybe more, and they couldn't see where the fire was coming from. Decker was shouting into his radio, demanding air support, demanding artillery, demanding anything that could save his team from an enemy that didn't exist on any of their screens. The thermal operator kept sweeping his useless scope across a slope that registered as empty while bullets continued to rain down from positions that should have been impossible. On the ridge above, Elena had already begun her work. The moment the first shots echoed through the valley, she shifted from observation to engagement. Her mirror caught the muzzle flashes that were invisible to direct observation, the brief flickers of light that bounced off rock walls and revealed exactly where each shooter was positioned. The enemy had built an L-shaped ambush, 15 fighters spread across 2 converging lines of fire. They had chosen their positions with expertise, selecting locations where the sun-heated rocks would mask their thermal signatures completely. Against any other opponent, it would have been a massacre. Elena found the first shooter through reflected light and put a round through his chest before he could fire again. The second was already in her sights, a shadow against shadows that her mirror had betrayed. Webb called distances and wind corrections while she worked. 1,300 meters, wind left to right, 2 minutes. She adjusted and fired. Another body crumpled among the rocks. The enemy fighters had been trained to watch for scope glare, for the telltale flash that marked a sniper's position. But Elena wasn't using her scope except for the final moment of aim. The mirror gave her everything she needed without ever revealing her location, without creating the signature they had learned to hunt. For kills in 90 seconds, she shifted to her second rifle, leaving the first to cool so its barrel heat wouldn't betray her to any thermal imaging the enemy might possess. On the valley floor, Torres had dragged one of the wounded rangers behind a rock formation and was applying pressure to a leg wound that pulsed blood with every heartbeat. The gunfire from the western slope had begun to slacken, individual weapons falling silent in a pattern that made no sense. He risked a glance over his cover and saw something that stopped his breath. A fighter on the slope above was rising from his position, perhaps to relocate, perhaps to get a better angle on the pinned rangers. The man made it 2 steps before his head snapped back, and he collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Torres hadn't heard the shot. The distance was too great, the sound lost in the chaos of the firefight. But he knew where it had come from. The Marine sniper. The woman with the mirror. Elena was on her 7th kill when she identified the enemy commander. He was positioned at the apex of the formation, directing fire with hand signals that her mirror caught in fragmented reflections. A radio antenna jutted from his pack, catching sunlight that revealed his exact location. She chambered a fresh round and settled her crosshairs on a point 1,400 meters distant. The wind had shifted slightly, pushing left. She compensated, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed. The commander dropped. His radio tumbled from his hand and clattered down the slope. Webb marked the position on his map. 8 confirmed. The enemy formation was beginning to collapse. Without their commander, the fighters lost coordination. Some continued firing at the rangers below, but others began to pull back, seeking escape routes that would take them out of the kill zone. Elena caught each movement in her mirror, the reflected light betraying every shift in position. A fighter rising to run. A fighter crawling toward better cover. A fighter turning to help a wounded comrade. She fired until her second rifle grew warm, then shifted to her third. Decker's voice was still screaming over the radio, demanding support that couldn't arrive fast enough to matter. Torres heard him shouting about casualties, about being pinned down, about an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fight. But the gunfire from the slope was dying, one weapon at a time, falling silent. Webb's voice was hoarse as he updated the count. 9 confirmed. The enemy's rate of fire is dropping. Elena didn't respond. She was already sweeping the mirror across the next sector, searching for the reflections that would tell her where the remaining fighters had gone. The sun continued its climb toward noon, flooding the valley with light that turned every rock into a mirror and every shadow into a hiding place. The enemy had built their ambush around that light, had trusted it to keep them invisible. They had never considered that someone might use the same light against them. Elena found another target and fired. 10. The noon sun reached its apex and turned the valley into a furnace of light. Heat shimmered off every rock surface, creating waves of distortion that made the terrain seem to breathe and shift. Through any magnified optic, the world became a blur of thermal noise, a useless smear of information that revealed nothing. Elena worked in the shadows of her hide site, untouched by the sun that was blinding everyone else in the valley. Her mirror caught the light and redirected it, turning the enemy's greatest advantage into their destruction. 11. 12. Webb had stopped announcing the count aloud. His map was covered in marks, each one representing a position that had seemed invisible until Elena's mirror found it. He tracked her shots with quiet efficiency, confirming kills through his spotting scope in the brief moments when the heat shimmer allowed clear observation. The enemy fighters had realized something was wrong. Their commander was dead, their coordinated ambush shattered, and one by one their positions were being eliminated by a shooter they couldn't locate. Some tried to withdraw, breaking from cover to scramble toward escape routes along the ridge. Every movement betrayed them. Sunlight flashed off belt buckles, off rifle barrels, off the sweat-slick skin of men who had never considered that the light itself could be their enemy. Elena caught each reflection and answered it with a bullet. 13. 14. On the valley floor, Decker had finally stopped demanding air support. The radio net had gone quiet except for terse status reports from his scatter team. 2 wounded Rangers were sheltered behind a rock formation, one applying pressure to the other's shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. The rest of the team was pinned in positions they had reached during the initial chaos, unable to advance or retreat while enemy fire still crackled from the slopes above. But that fire was growing sporadic. Weapons that had been hammering the Rangers' positions fell silent one after another, replaced by a stillness that seemed more threatening than the gunfire had been. Torres crouched behind his boulder and watched the western slope. He had lost track of how many times he had seen a muzzle flash followed by sudden silence. How many enemy positions had simply stopped firing without any visible cause. The Marine sniper was out there somewhere, invisible and relentless, doing what 8 Rangers with the most advanced equipment in the world could not do. Decker's voice came over the radio, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Ranger element, prepare to break for cover on my mark. We need to consolidate position. Torres looked at the ground they would have to cross. 30 meters of open terrain to reach a cluster of boulders that would provide real protection. 30 meters that any surviving enemy fighters would have perfectly covered. He keyed his radio. Sergeant, there could be shooters tracking that route. Our thermals can't see them. We don't have a choice, Decker replied. We can't stay here. On the ridge, Elena heard the exchange through her own radio. She swept her mirror across the escape route the Rangers were planning to use, catching reflections off the rocks and scanning for any sign of enemy presence. There, 2 flickers of light, close together. 2 fighters positioned to cover exactly the ground the Rangers needed to cross. They had anticipated the breakout and were waiting. She found a first target through the reflection, a man pressed against a boulder with his rifle aimed at the open ground below. She fired, and he slumped forward. The second fighter reacted to his companion's death, rising slightly to see what had happened. His movement created a flash of light off his scope. Elena fired again. 15. She keyed her radio. Overwatch to Ranger element. Your route is clear. 2 hostiles eliminated at grid reference Ferrightwo, 2 Savinon. Decker's response came after a long pause. How are you seeing them? The mirror, Sergeant. Silence on the radio. Then Decker's voice, flat and stripped of everything except the need to survive. Ranger element, move now. Go, go, go. Torres broke from cover and sprinted across the open ground, his boots pounding against sun-baked earth. He expected to feel the impact of a bullet at any moment, expected to hear the crack of a rifle that would end his life in this valley he couldn't even properly see. Nothing came. He reached the boulders and threw himself behind them, gasping for breath. Other Rangers followed, scrambling across the ground that should have been a kill zone. The wounded were dragged by their teammates, leaving trails of blood in the dust. When the last Ranger reached cover, Torres looked up at the ridge where Elena had her position. He still couldn't see her, couldn't see any indication that she existed at all. But she had cleared their path. She had seen what they couldn't see and killed what they couldn't kill. Elena ejected her spent magazine and loaded a fresh one. The enemy's fire had died to nothing, the last few fighters either dead or fleeing through routes she couldn't cover from her position. She swept the mirror one final time across the valley, searching for any reflection that might indicate a threat. The slopes were still. The ambush was broken. Webb let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. 15 confirmed, he said. Maybe more we couldn't verify. Elena lowered her rifle and looked down at the valley where the Rangers were finally regrouping. The sun blazed overhead, flooding every surface with light that should have protected the enemy. Instead, it had destroyed them. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western ridge when Elena caught the movement. A cluster of reflections, scattered and frantic, bouncing off equipment and exposed skin as the surviving enemy fighters fled through a narrow canyon that cut between two rock formations. She counted the flickers. 12, maybe more, moving fast, trying to escape the valley that had become their graveyard. Webb, she said. Canyon at bearing 275. Multiple runners. He swung his spotting scope toward the canyon mouth. I can't see them. The walls are blocking direct observation. Elena angled her mirror to catch the light penetrating the canyon's upper reaches. The reflected beam bounced off the curved rock walls and illuminated shapes that no direct line of sight could have revealed. Men scrambling over loose stone, weapons clutched against their chests, desperate to reach the far end before whatever had killed their comrades found them too. She calculated the angles. The canyon curved left approximately 200 meters in, which meant her bullets would need to account for the wind channeling through the gap. The walls would create unpredictable eddies, swirling currents of air that could push a round off target by inches that translated to misses at this distance. 1,600 meters to the canyon mouth. Another 100 to the first cluster of runners. She settled behind her rifle and let her breathing slow. The mirror showed her a fighter at the front of the group, a man moving faster than the others, perhaps hoping to scout the exit before committing his companions to the open ground beyond. Elena tracked his movement through the reflected light, predicting where he would be when her bullet arrived. She squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle pulse against her shoulder, and watched through the mirror as the runner pitched forward and lay still. The others scattered. Some pressed against the canyon walls, seeking cover that didn't exist from an angle they couldn't comprehend. Others broke into desperate sprints, gambling that speed would save them where concealment had failed. Elena worked methodically. Each shot was a calculation of wind and distance and the curved geometry of the canyon that turned simple trajectories into complex equations. The mirror showed her targets that should have been impossible, men hidden behind rock lips and buried in shadows that would have defeated any conventional optic. 17, 18, 19. Webb stopped trying to confirm kills through his spotting scope. He couldn't see into the canyon the way she couldn't track the reflections that told her exactly where each fighter had gone. Instead, he counted her shots and trusted that each one found its mark. The enemy fighters had stopped trying to run. Those who remained alive had pressed themselves into whatever cover the canyon offered, hoping that stillness would protect them from the death that kept finding their companions. But stillness created different reflections, stable points of light that Elena could study and analyze and ultimately exploit. 20, 21. A fighter broke from cover and sprinted for a gap between two boulders. He made it 3 steps before Elena's round caught him in the chest. Another tried to follow, perhaps thinking the first man had drawn fire and created an opening. She proved him wrong. 22, 23. The canyon had become a tomb. Bodies lay scattered across the rocky ground, draped over boulders and crumpled in crevices, marking the positions they had thought would save them. The survivors had stopped moving entirely, frozen in place by the understanding that any motion would be their last. Elena swept the mirror one final time, catching the faint reflections that revealed the last 4 fighters. They were clustered near the canyon's far end, pressed against a rock wall that would have hidden them from any observer at her position. But the mirror didn't care about direct lines of sight. It found the light bouncing off the stones above them and redirected it to show her exactly where they crouched. She fired 4 times in steady succession. Each shot echoed off the canyon walls, layered sounds that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Webb exhaled slowly. "That's 27, he said. 27 confirmed. Elena lowered her rifle and looked down at the valley. The Rangers had emerged from their cover and were moving cautiously toward the canyon mouth, weapons raised against threats that no longer existed. Decker walked at the center of the formation, his thermal scope hanging useless at his side. Specialist Torres reached the canyon first. He stood at the entrance and stared at the bodies scattered across the ground, at positions that made no sense from where he stood. Some of the dead were hidden behind rocks that should have provided complete protection. Others lay in shadows so deep that direct observation would have been impossible. He looked up at the ridge where Elena had spent the last 6 hours dismantling an enemy force that had been designed to defeat everything the American military could bring against it. He still couldn't see her, couldn't identify any position that would have allowed the shots he was looking at. Decker arrived at the canyon mouth and stopped beside Torres. His face was blank, empty to the arrogance that had defined him since he arrived at FOB Viper. He raised his thermal scope and swept it across the canyon, across the bodies, across the rocks that still radiated heat from the afternoon sun. The scope showed nothing, just hot stones and the ghosts of men it had never been able to see. The distant thump of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley as QRF birds approached to evacuate the wounded. Torres helped lift one of the injured Rangers onto a stretcher, a man who would walk again because a woman with a tiny mirror had seen what no one else could see. 27 enemies, 0 friendly deaths. The mirror had one. Captain Reyes spread the after-action photographs across his desk and tried to make the geometry work. The intelligence office at FOB Viper was quiet at 1900 hours, most of the staff having rotated out for evening chow, leaving him alone with images that refused to make sense. He had plotted Elena's position on the map first. Overwatch Alpha, a recessed ledge on the eastern ridge with clear sight lines to the valley floor. Standard sniper placement, nothing unusual. Then he had plotted the enemy positions, marking each body's GPS coordinates as reported by the recovery team. The problem was that 7 of those positions should have been impossible to hit from Overwatch Alpha. Reyes pulled up the terrain analysis software and ran linear site calculations. Target 14 had been behind a rock formation that created complete visual defilade from any eastern position. Target 19 had been in a shadow so deep that even afternoon sun couldn't penetrate it. Target 23 had been around a curve in the canyon, physically blocked from direct observation by 40 meters of solid stone. Yet each of them had a single bullet wound. Each of them had died from a shot fired from the same rifle, confirmed by ballistics recovery. He sat back in his chair and stared at the map until his eyes ached. Then he reached for his radio. Staff Sergeant Vance reported to the intelligence office 20 minutes later, her gear bag slung over one shoulder. She looked tired in the way that combat always made people tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep wouldn't fully cure. Reyes gestured to the photographs on his desk. "I'm having trouble understanding how you made some of these shots." Elena set her bag on the floor and looked at the images without expression. "Which ones?" "All of them," Reyes admitted. He pointed to the map. "This target here, number 14. He was in complete defilade from your position. No direct line of sight. Ballistics confirms your rifle made the kill, but I can't figure out how you saw him." Elena reached into her breast pocket and produced a mirror. She held it out to Reyes, who took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The edges had been filed down with precision he associated with machine shop work. The backing was painted matte black, eliminating any secondary reflection. And scratched into the surface was a grid of fine lines, each one measured and etched with obvious care. "You used this," he said. Elena nodded. "Reflected light shows what direct observation can't see. The sun angle creates glare on standard optics, but the mirror turns that same light into a detection tool." Reyes held the mirror up to his desk lamp, watching how the light bounced and scattered. "Show me." Elena took the mirror back and angled it toward the window. Even in the dim evening light, The reflection caught details across the room that Reyes hadn't noticed. The dust on a filing cabinet, the shadow behind her equipment rack, the glint of a pen on a desk 30 feet away. In the valley, she said, the sun creates reflections off everything. Rifle scopes, belt buckles, sweat on skin. The mirror catches those reflections and shows me exactly where the source is, even if the source is behind cover from my direct position. Reyes thought about the implications. You had omnidirectional observation, he said slowly. You could see around corners, into shadows, behind rocks. And you never had to expose your own optic to do it. The enemy watches for scope glare, Elena said. They've learned what American equipment looks like, but they don't know how to spot reflected light from a mirror 6 inches wide. Reyes looked back at the photographs, at the bodies in impossible positions, at the geometry that suddenly made perfect sense. Staff Sergeant, he said, I think you may have developed something significant. Elena shrugged. It only works in certain conditions. High sun angle, reflective terrain. Afghanistan is ideal. Other environments would require different techniques. But in those conditions, Reyes pressed, you were effectively invisible while having complete battlefield awareness. Elena didn't respond, but her silence was confirmation enough. Reyes reached for his phone. He needed to call Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw. He needed to document this properly, run it up the chain to people who understood doctrinal implications. A single modification, a filed-down signal mirror, had allowed one sniper to eliminate an entire enemy force that had been specifically positioned to defeat American technology. Sir, Elena said as he began dialing. Master Sergeant Decker submitted his after-action report an hour ago. He claimed the engagement was a joint effort. Reyes paused. And you're telling me this because? Because I don't care about credit. I care about the technique being understood correctly. If his report says joint effort, someone might conclude that thermal imaging played a role it didn't play. Reyes set the phone down. He would need to review Decker's report before making his call. He would need to compare it against the drone footage, against the radio logs, against the physical evidence scattered across a valley that still smelled like cordite and death. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, he said. I'll make sure the documentation is accurate. Elena picked up her gear bag and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Captain, the technique isn't complicated. Anyone could learn it in a few hours. The hard part is being patient enough to trust what the light shows you instead of what your eyes expect to see. She left without waiting for a response. Reyes looked down at the photographs one more time, at the impossible shots that were suddenly possible, at the bodies of men who had died because they trusted the wrong assumptions about what Americans could and couldn't do. Then he picked up the phone and dialed Bradshaw's number. Sir, he said when the colonel answered, you need to see this. We may have just witnessed a fundamental shift in sniper doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Bradshaw's helicopter touched down at FOB Viper at 0745, rotor wash scattering dust across the landing zone as Colonel Morrison stepped out behind him. The regiment commander had insisted on seeing the evidence firsthand after Reyes's call the night before, and Bradshaw had learned long ago not to argue when a full-bird colonel wanted to investigate something personally. They found Elena waiting in the briefing room with her equipment laid out on the table. The 3 rifles she had used in the engagement, the spotting scope, the rangefinder, and, at the center, looking almost absurdly small among the military hardware, the mirror. Morrison picked it up without preamble. This is it? Yes, sir, Elena said. The colonel turned it over in his hands, examining the filed edges and the etched grid lines. He held it up to the window, watching how the morning light scattered across its surface. Explain how it works. Elena took the mirror and angled it toward the compound outside. The reflection caught movement near the motor pool, a mechanic walking between vehicles who was invisible from their direct line of sight through the window. The mirror redirects light from sources I can't see directly, she said. In a valley yesterday, the enemy chose positions that defeated thermal imaging and direct observation. But they couldn't hide from reflected light. Every piece of metal, every exposed surface, every movement created a reflection that the mirror could catch. Morrison watched the mechanic appear and disappear in the mirror surface as Elena, adjusted the angle. And you developed this technique yourself? I refined it, sir. The basic concept came from a Vietnamese instructor who learned to work in conditions where standard optics failed. I adapted his methods for desert environments. Bradshaw stepped forward. Sir, Captain Reyes has prepared analysis of the engagement. The drone footage is particularly relevant. They moved to the screen where Reyes had cued the overhead imagery. The footage showed the valley from 2,000 feet, thermal overlay highlighting heat signatures across the terrain. Rangers appeared as bright spots moving through the lower elevations. Elena's position on the ridge was invisible, her shadowed hide site reading the same temperature as the surrounding rock. The ambush began at timestamp 11 hours, 7 minutes, and 33 seconds. Muzzle flashes erupted across the western slope, but the thermal overlay showed nothing at those positions. The rocks had absorbed enough morning sun to mask the fighters completely. Watch the enemy positions, Reyes said. He pointed to a cluster of boulders on the screen. Thermal shows this area as empty throughout the engagement. But here, he tapped a timestamp, and here we see muzzle flashes from fighters our equipment couldn't detect. Morrison leaned closer. And Staff Sergeant Vance was eliminating these targets? Yes, sir. Reyes advanced the footage. Each time a muzzle flash appears, it stops within seconds. She was identifying and engaging targets that our thermal imaging classified as empty terrain. The footage continued, showing the Rangers pinned in their positions while one by one the enemy weapons fell silent. No visible cause, no explanation in the thermal data. Just the steady elimination of threats that shouldn't have existed. Morrison straightened. Why isn't this standard doctrine? Elena answered. The technique only works in specific conditions, sir. High sun angle, reflective terrain, stable atmospheric conditions. Afghanistan is ideal. A jungle environment or urban setting would require completely different methods. But in these conditions, Morrison said, you were the only asset we had that could actually see the enemy. Yes, sir. The colonel turned to Bradshaw. I want Master Sergeant Decker in here. Now. Decker arrived 8 minutes later, his uniform pressed and his expression carefully neutral. He saluted Morrison and took a position near the door, as far from Elena as the room allowed. Morrison didn't waste time on pleasantries. Master Sergeant, your after-action report describes the Shadal Valley engagement as a joint effort. He let the words hang in the air. Define joint effort for me. Decker's jaw tightened. Sir, my team and the Marine sniper element were both engaged in the operation. We worked together to neutralize the enemy force. Morrison nodded toward the screen. Captain Reyes, show him the footage. The drone imagery played again. Rangers pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Thermal scopes sweeping across empty terrain while bullets impacted around them. Enemy positions falling silent one by one through no visible action from the Ranger element. At what point during this engagement, Morrison asked, did your team eliminate an enemy combatant? Decker's silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. At what point, Morrison continued, did you request Staff Sergeant Vance's assistance after dismissing her initial target reports as, and I'm quoting from the radio log, jumping as shadows? Sir, my thermal showed nothing at those positions. Standard protocol is to trust verified equipment over unverified claims. Morrison stepped closer to Decker. Your verified equipment failed to detect a 15-man ambush that wounded 2 of your Rangers. Staff Sergeant Vance's unverified claims identified every enemy position in the valley. He paused. Your refusal to accept her intelligence could have resulted in the death of your entire team. Decker's face had gone pale. Sir, I was following established procedure. Established procedure got 2 of your men shot. Morrison turned away. Colonel Bradshaw, I want a full review of Master Sergeant Decker's conduct during this operation. And I want Staff Sergeant Vance's technique documented and submitted to the sniper school for evaluation. Yes, sir, Bradshaw said. Morrison looked at Elena one last time. Staff Sergeant, outstanding work. He walked out of the briefing room without acknowledging Decker again. Decker stood motionless as Bradshaw followed the colonel out. His eyes found Elena across the room, filled with something that might have been hatred or humiliation or both. Elena picked up her mirror and slipped it into her pocket. She gathered her rifles and walked past him toward the door, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The mirror had already shown her everything she needed to see. The private office adjacent to the FOB command center had been cleared of everyone except Decker and the two screens mounted on the far wall. Colonel Morrison occupied one screen, his face rendered in slightly pixelated detail by the satellite connection. The other screen showed Colonel Hartley, Ranger Battalion Commander, calling in from Fort Benning with an expression that suggested he had already made up his mind about what he was seeing. Master Sergeant Decker, Hartley began, "I've reviewed the statements provided by members of your team. Several of them reference comments you made prior to the operation." He glanced down at papers in front of him. Museum equipment. Girl Scout nonsense. Would you care to explain these remarks? Decker stood at parade rest, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, I was expressing healthy tactical skepticism about unconventional methods. It's standard practice to question approaches that deviate from established doctrine." "Healthy tactical skepticism," Morrison repeated. He leaned toward his camera. "Master Sergeant, I have radio logs from the engagement. At 0914, Staff Sergeant Vance reported an enemy position at Grid Reference Force Eventer 263. Your response was, and I quote, 'Negative Overwatch. Thermal shows nothing at that grid. You're jumping at shadows.'" He paused. "Ballistics confirms an enemy combatant was killed at that exact position moments later." "Sir, my equipment showed no contacts. I made the call based on available information." "Your equipment was wrong," Hartley said. "Staff Sergeant Vance's information was correct. Yet you continued to dismiss her reports throughout the engagement." He shuffled his papers. At 0923, she reported 2 additional positions. You did not respond. At 0947, she reported enemy movement along the western ridge. You did not respond. At 1107, your team was ambushed by fighters in positions she had attempted to warn you about. Decker's jaw worked silently. "Sir, in the heat of combat, communication breakdowns occur." "This wasn't a breakdown," Morrison said. "This was deliberate dismissal of accurate intelligence, because you had already decided the source wasn't worth listening to." He let the words settle. "2 of your Rangers were wounded in that ambush, Master Sergeant. An ambush that might have been prevented if you had listened." Hartley leaned forward. "There's another matter. Your after-action report describes the engagement as a joint effort. Drone footage shows your team pinned down for the duration of the firefight. Staff Sergeant Vance eliminated 27 enemy combatants. Your team eliminated 0. He removed his glasses and set them on his desk. "That report constitutes a false official statement, Master Sergeant." The color drained from Decker's face. "Sir, I was attempting to reflect the collaborative nature of joint operations. You were attempting to take credit for a victory you had no part in achieving," Hartley said, "while simultaneously obscuring your own failures of judgment that endangered your men." He put his glasses back on. "Your career is now under formal review. You will remain at FOB Viper until transport can be arranged for your return to Fort Benning." Dismissed. The screens went dark simultaneously, leaving Decker alone in the office with the hum of the air conditioning and the weight of everything he had just lost. Across the compound, Specialist Torres pushed through the flap of the medical tent where the 2 wounded Rangers were recovering. Sergeant Michaels had taken a round through the shoulder that had shattered his collarbone. Private Chun had a through hand throw in his thigh that had missed the femoral artery by centimeters. Both would recover. Both would walk again. Both wanted to know what had actually happened in the valley. Torres pulled up a folding chair between their cots and told them the truth. He described the ambush, the useless thermal sweeps, the bullets impacting around them from positions their equipment couldn't detect. He described the enemy weapons falling silent one by one, eliminated by a shooter none of them could see. He described the canyon at the end, the bodies in impossible positions, the geometry that made no sense until you understood what the Marine sniper had been doing. "She saved us," Chun said when Torres finished. The woman Decker was mocking. Torres nodded. 27 kills. Every single enemy fighter in that valley. We didn't get one. Michael shifted in his cot and winced at the movement. I owe her a beer. He paused, and an apology. We all laughed when Decker made those jokes. Torres stood and pushed the chair back against the tent wall. Yeah, he said. We did. He found Elena in the armory, seated at the same table where he had first seen her 2 days earlier. She was cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision, running a patch through the barrel with movements that suggested she had performed this ritual 10,000 times before. Torres stopped a few feet from the table. She didn't look up. Staff Sergeant, he said, I wanted to thank you for what you did in the valley. Elena pulled the patch through and inspected it. Just doing my job, specialist. You saved my life. You saved all of us. She set the patch aside and reached for a fresh one. The rifle needed cleaning. That was the job in front of her. Everything else was just noise. Torres stood there for a long moment, waiting for something more. An acknowledgement. A response. Anything that would let him feel like he had properly expressed what he owed her. Elena threaded the fresh patch and began another pass through the barrel. Torres finally nodded, more to himself than to her, and walked out of the armory. Behind him, Elena continued her work in silence, the only sound the soft whisper of cloth against steel. The mirror sat on the table beside her, its filed edges catching the overhead light. It didn't need thanks. It didn't need recognition. It just needed someone patient enough to use it. The helicopter banked over Camp Leatherneck and began its descent toward the main landing zone. Elena watched the sprawling base pass beneath her, the orderly rows of tents and hardened structures that housed the nerve center of Marine operations in Helmand Province. She had been here twice before, both times for routine administrative matters that required signatures from people above her pay grade. This visit was different. The summons had come directly from General Warren's office, MARSOC commander, with no explanation beyond a time and a building number. A staff sergeant met her at the landing zone and escorted her across the compound without small talk. They passed motor pools and communication centers, mess halls and armories, the machinery of war humming along with the efficiency of long practice. Marines glanced at her as she walked, their eyes catching on her scout sniper insignia before moving on. The headquarters building was air-conditioned to a temperature that felt almost obscene after months in the Kiener heat. Elena followed her escort down a corridor lined with photographs of Marine commanders past and present, their faces watching her approach with the stern dignity of men who had sent other men to die. General Warren's office occupied the corner of the second floor. The escort knocked once and opened the door without waiting for a response. The general stood behind his desk, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that had seen enough combat to recognize it in others. He returned Elena's salute and gestured to a chair across from him. Staff Sergeant Vance, thank you for coming. Elena sat and waited. She had learned long ago that generals didn't summon enlisted personnel for casual conversation. Warren picked up a folder from his desk and opened it. I've read Captain Reyes's analysis of your engagement in Shad al Valley. I've reviewed the drone footage and the ballistics reports. He looked up at her. 27 confirmed kills using a technique that doesn't exist in any training manual we have. It's not complicated, sir. Anyone could learn it. Warren smiled slightly. That's exactly my point. He closed the folder. Your technique is being analyzed for potential integration into Scout sniper training at Quantico. The preliminary assessment suggests it could be valuable in multiple theater environments where thermal imaging is compromised. Elena nodded. She had expected something like this, had known from the moment Reyes started asking questions that her method would eventually make its way up the chain. What I'm asking, Warren continued, is whether you'd consider taking an instructor rotation stateside. Help us develop the training curriculum. Teach other snipers what you know. The words settled in the air between them. Elena thought about the valley, about the Rangers pinned down and the enemy positions that no one else could see. She thought about Webb calling out distances while she worked, about the rhythm of combat that had become as natural to her as breathing. Sir, she said carefully, I'm effective in the field. I'm not sure I'd be effective in a classroom. Warren leaned back in his chair. Staff Sergeant, There are 27 people who didn't die in that valley because of what you know. He paused. There are rangers who went home to their families because you could see what their equipment couldn't show them. If you can teach even a handful of other snipers to do what you do, how many more people don't die? Elena didn't have an answer for that. The mathematics of lives saved versus lives taken was something she had stopped calculating years ago. It was easier to focus on the next shot, the next target, the next mission. But Warren wasn't wrong. The technique worked. And if it could be taught, if other snipers could learn to see the way she saw, then the value extended far beyond one valley in Kiener Province. "I'd want to return to operational status after one training cycle," she said. Warren nodded. "That could be arranged." "Then I accept, sir." The general stood and walked around his desk. He picked up a small box that had been sitting on the corner, half hidden behind a stack of papers. "One more thing, Staff Sergeant." He opened the box and removed a bronze medal suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy, you are hereby awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for exceptional meritorious service in combat operations." He read from a citation in the box. "For innovative application of unconventional observation techniques that resulted in the elimination of 27 enemy combatants and the preservation of friendly forces under fire." He pinned the medal to her uniform, the bronze weight settling against her chest just above her heart. Elena looked down at it and thought about Master Sergeant Collins, the Vietnam veteran who had taught a nearly empty classroom about light and shadows and patience. He had died 3 years after that seminar, liver cancer that had spread too far before anyone caught it. She had sent flowers to his funeral and received a handwritten note from his widow, thanking her for remembering. Now she was the link in that chain. The knowledge that had passed from jungle to desert would pass again, from her hands to others who would carry it forward. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant," Warren said. "You've earned this." Elena saluted and walked out of the office, the medal a small weight on her chest that felt heavier than it should. She made her way back through the corridor, past the photographs of commanders, past the staff sergeant who had escorted her in. Outside the headquarters building, a group of newly arrived Rangers was forming up near a transport vehicle. They wore fresh uniforms and carried equipment that gleamed with factory newness, their faces holding the eager anticipation of men who had not yet learned what combat actually looked like. None of them glanced at Elena as she passed. None of them knew who she was or what she had done in a valley they had never heard of. She preferred it that way. The mirror in her pocket caught the afternoon sun as she walked toward the landing zone, its filed edges warm against her thigh. It didn't need recognition either. It just needed someone willing to see what it could show them. Elena boarded the helicopter back to FOB Viper and watched Camp Leatherneck shrink beneath her. In 3 months, she would be at Quantico, standing in front of a classroom of snipers who had never heard of reflected light observation. She would teach them what Collins had taught her. And maybe someday, one of them would teach someone else. That was how knowledge survived, one link at a time. The morning sun rose over Quantico with the slow patience of late autumn, casting long shadows across the training range where 12 Marine Scout sniper candidates stood in a loose formation. Elena walked the line, studying each face, remembering her own time standing in a formation just like this one, wondering what secrets the instructors knew that she didn't. She stopped at the center of the group and held up the mirror. Its edges were more worn now than they had been 6 months ago, the filed metal showing the dull patina of constant handling. New scratches marked the surface where she had demonstrated the technique to 3 previous classes. Each mark a small record of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. "Who can tell me what this is?" she asked. "A signal mirror, Staff Sergeant." The answer came from a lance corporal at the end of the line, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who had memorized the equipment manual. Elena nodded. "And what is it used for?" "Emergency signaling. Attracting rescue aircraft. Communication over distances where radio isn't available." She turned the mirror over in her hands, letting the morning light catch its surface. "What if I told you this piece of equipment, which costs less than $10 and weighs less than your watch, saved the lives of 8 Army Rangers in Afghanistan?" The formation shifted slightly. Curious glances exchanged between candidates who had heard rumors about the instructor but didn't know the full story. Elena angled the mirror toward the tree line at the edge of the range. The reflected light scattered across the shadows, illuminating details that direct observation couldn't reveal. A target silhouette positioned behind a berm, a brass casing half buried in the leaves, the glint of a scope lens from a hide site 200 meters out. "Your optics will fail you," she said. "Thermal imaging can be defeated. Magnified scopes create signatures that enemy spotters are trained to detect." She lowered the mirror. But reflected light shows what direct observation cannot see. And the enemy doesn't know how to hide from something they've never encountered. She spent the next 3 hours walking the candidates through the technique. Angle calculations, light source positioning. The patients required to trust reflections over instinct. Some of them struggled with the concept, their training having taught them to rely on equipment that cost thousands of dollars rather than principles that cost nothing but attention. Others understood immediately. A sergeant from Camp Pendleton adapted so quickly that Elena had him demonstrating to his peers by the end of the first session. A corporal from 29 Palms asked questions that pushed even Elena's understanding of the technique's limitations. This was how knowledge survived, not through manuals or official doctrine, but through the small exchanges between people who understood that the best tools were often the simplest ones. At the end of the session, a private first class raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, I heard you used this technique in some big engagement overseas. Is it true you got 27 kills in one day?" Elena looked at him for a long moment. The number had followed her from Afghanistan like a shadow, growing larger with each retelling until it had become something almost mythical. She had never corrected the stories. The truth was simpler and less impressive than legend made it sound. "The mirror did the work," she said. "I just knew how to use it." The answer satisfied some of them. Others looked skeptical, convinced there had to be more to it than a filed-down signal mirror and patience. Let them wonder. The technique worked whether they believed in it or not. 2,000 miles away, Captain Reyes sat in his new office at CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, reviewing the latest batch of intelligence assessments. His analysis of the Shadal Valley engagement had been published 6 weeks earlier as a classified study on adaptive observation techniques. It was now required reading for Joint Operations Planning and Theater. He had received 3 requests already this month from units asking about implementation protocols. The technique was spreading, passed from sniper to sniper through the informal networks that carried operational knowledge faster than any official channel. At Fort Benning, Master Sergeant Decker stood before a classroom of basic training recruits, explaining the fundamentals of land navigation. His reassignment to the training battalion had come through 2 months after his return from Afghanistan. His career would recover. He would serve out his 20 years and collect his pension. But the next promotion board had passed him over without comment, and the one after that would do the same. Some failures left marks that didn't heal no matter how much time passed. In a small office at Fort Bragg, Sergeant Torres typed the final paragraph of his application essay for Ranger School. He described the valley, the ambush, the impossible shots from a shooter he had never seen. He wrote about the Marine Staff Sergeant who had dismissed thanks with a nod and gone back to cleaning her rifle, about the lesson he had learned watching enemy positions fall silent one by one. Observation technique adaptation, he wrote. The ability to see what others cannot see, to find solutions that don't exist in any manual. This is what I want to learn. This is what I want to become. Elena watched her students pack their gear as the afternoon sun dropped toward the Virginia hills. The private first class who had asked about the engagement lingered near the equipment rack, clearly working up courage for another question. "Staff Sergeant," he finally said, "what call sign did you use in Afghanistan?" Elena thought about the valley, about the mirror flashing in the noon sun, while enemies died in positions they thought were invisible. She thought about Collins, the Vietnam instructor who had taught her to see with light instead of lenses. She thought about the Rangers who had gone home to families that would never know how close they had come to losing them. "The mirror doesn't need a name," she said. She picked up her gear bag and walked toward the parking lot, leaving the private to puzzle over her answer. The evening light caught the mirror in her pocket one last time, its filed edges warm from a day of teaching. Somewhere out there, someone was learning to see what others missed. Someone was discovering that the most powerful tools were often the ones that everyone else dismissed. Maybe they were watching this story right now, recognizing something in it that spoke to their own experience. She wondered what they would do with that recognition. What dismissed technique would they master? What overlooked skill would they develop into something that changed everything? The mirror had shown her what the world refused to see. Maybe it could do the same for them. Elena climbed in her truck and drove toward the setting sun, leaving Quantico behind her. In 6 weeks, she would return to operational status. In 6 weeks, she would be back in the field, back in the shadows, back where the light could show her secrets that no one else knew how to find. Until then, she would teach. She would pass the knowledge forward, one link at a time.